Today, I'm going to do something I promised I would never do again, and I'm reminded of exactly why. Oh my God. Full disclosure, I am not a good designer. I wouldn't even call myself a designer at all. In fact, artificial intelligence came up with the concept for these chairs, and I thought it would be fun to bring them to life. Not the AI, the chairs. This also begs the question if a computer knows anything about comfort, and I have my doubts. There are plans available if you want to build a set for yourself. These are 12-foot-long boards of sapele, which is one of my favorite woods to work with. Plus, it's great for outdoor builds. Unfortunately, 12-foot-long boards are much too big for my feeble body to handle, and it's good practice to take your individual parts down as close to final size as possible. I like to give myself about 4 inches extra in length, which will take care of any potential snipe in the planer, and 3/4 of an inch in width. My preferred tool for breaking down rough-cut lumber is a jigsaw. Yes, slower than a circular saw, but a lot less can go wrong. Not only are these boards long, but they are also quite wide, so I'm able to get multiple parts out of each chunk after ripping these down on the bandsaw. Doing this now instead of after milling reduces material waste. This entire milling process is not mandatory. You could buy S3S lumber, which does come with a higher price tag, or you could decide you don't like the future owner of this chair and opt for big box or 2x4s. If you're getting ready to ask about pressure-treated lumber, my response back is, have you ever seen a wood fence that doesn't look like this in 2 years? I rest my case. However, if you want to justify the cost of all the expensive tools in your shop and you're going to buy rough cut, I found the key to proper milling is spacing everything out over a day or so. When you remove a bunch of material from the face of the board, it throws off the equilibrium, causing it to move. So my heavy milling is always done on day 1. But the key is to sticker and stack your boards at the end of the day so air can flow evenly. This will minimize movement. It's a bit like getting a new fish. You don't just throw them into the tank. You need to let that little guy get used to the water temp. The final day of milling is always very light passes to eliminate any movement that occurred after day 1. And trust me, those boards will move. And yes, I understand this is an outdoor chair and the wood will get all wonky soon enough, but let me be the crazy person I was born to be. These were 6/4 pieces to start with, and ended up just below 1.5 inches. If you're following along with the plans, the width of the frame piece has no impact on the measurements, so pick whatever you like. What makes this chair visually interesting are the tapers and angles on every piece. What makes this build intimidating are the same tapers and angles. But fear not, I will show how easy this really is. I'm starting with the front leg and marking out the initial angle where the foot will make contact with the ground. The MVP of this build will be this digital angle gauge, and yes, there will be a link below. I'm going to show a couple different options for making these cuts. First up, my match fit sled. I like to bring it over to the side of the table saw so I can overhang the workpiece and line it up with the edge of the sled. Once that's good, I can clamp the workpiece into place and secure the stop blocks so I can easily duplicate this cut. The name of the game for this part of the build is repeatability. It's more important to make identical cuts on all like pieces than it is to nail the measurements from the plans. Don't fall in love with every exact measurement, and I'll show you a good example of that in just a minute. Also, don't throw away those off-cut pieces, we will need them later on. Once I have the first cut done on all 4 pieces, it's time to establish the angle where the top of the leg meets the back leg. Now, I'm not sure how I thought of this, but that second piece gives my tape measure something to latch onto. A shockingly smart hack for me. The best thing about this match fit sled is how quickly you can swap from one cut to the next simply by adjusting the stop blocks and moving on with your project. When cutting a piece that has no square parts like these, you always want to establish the top and bottom angles first, then mark and line up the start and stop point of the tapers with the edge of your sled. It's tough to see this on video, but there is so much material overhanging during the cut that it was bouncing, which resulted in a lot of burning. A less wise version of myself would have just tried to sand that away, but I am evolving these days. Remember I said don't fall in love with exact measurements? These legs will now have a slightly different taper, but it won't impact it at all. So I trim a tiny bit more off each piece to save myself hours of sanding. In hindsight, I should have cut away most of the waste side with a jigsaw or bandsaw before making the taper cut. But now you know, and we have 4 front legs. Option 2 for cutting angles and tapers, a different type of sled. I'll demonstrate this on the backrest portion of the chair and need to rip those pieces down just barely oversized first. I've talked about these Craig miter bars before. They are so useful for something like this. After securing one to the bottom of my sled, I can establish the zero clearance and get to work. The process for marking all of my cuts is the same, but I'll use some scrap pieces of plywood secured with double-sided carpet tape as the stop blocks. If you are planning on building a more permanent sled, I would secure each one from the underside with screws too. Where it's necessary and you need a second hand, adding a toggle clamp to use as a hold down is advised. After establishing the first cut, I can add more stop blocks for cut number 2. And I even got resourceful because I used the off cut and taped it down. Look, I'm no MacGyver, but not bad for a skinny Jew. Alright, stay with me because I'm about to blow your mind in a minute. The last cut needed is a taper, and I'll use more offcuts plus scrap plywood to set all the stops. If you plan it out well enough, the diagonal stops can also double as spots to hold more toggle clamps, which you definitely want here. Yes, I've talked about these toggle clamps in my favorite tools videos. I actually use the things I tell you I like, I'm not just shilling nonsense. Now, the moment you've been waiting for. This is why a sled like this is really great. I can make all 3 cuts in succession in under 1 minute. So why would you pick this option versus option 1? I would only make individual sleds for each piece if you were batching out lots of these chairs and wanted to sell them. Otherwise, it's just not worth it. But if you do want to make money, this is how you save time, and it can be applied to so many other builds in your shop, not just these chairs. Thankfully, I am not a production shop. Just a simple man in a simple garage making 2 robot chairs for my front porch. In fact, one of the hardest lessons I learned over the years is you will not get rich building chairs. For whatever reason, people are much more comfortable dropping $4,000 on fake rivers made of plastic that take a fraction of the time to build compared to something you sit in. It's why I told myself I would never build another chair again. And yet, here we are. So don't buy these plans with any grand illusions of quitting your job. But if you want to challenge yourself and learn new skills, I encourage everyone to take on a chair project if you've avoided them in the past. They are much less scary than they appear. Now, I would be lying if I said they are easy, especially if you're a dummy like me, because after cutting 2 of these back legs, I noticed something was off. Oh, you idiot, John. Oh, you idiot, you idiot. Yep, I struggle with basic math and cut those 4 inches short. I like to show unique ways of fixing happy accidents, but sometimes the easiest thing to do is mill up more wood and recut the parts. Of course, when it rains, it pours, because after a couple swipes with the jointer, I remembered why I didn't use this piece to begin with. Sapele is normally really pretty, but this was mostly ugly sapwood, and I didn't want to ruin the final look. So I'll let In the Moment John take it away.
It's not bad. Oh no, that's pretty bad. That's horrible. Son of a...
Of course, the only extra boards I had lying around were too wide for the jointer. So angry bandsaw time, screw turning on the dust collection, angrier jointing session, and followed up with the punishment of planing on the floor because I deserve it. Quick shout out to this Wixie digital readout that is ideal when you need to come back midway through a project. Not that I know anything about that. After a 45-minute adventure of anger and despair, I can recut these 2 new pieces and quadruple check my final measurement before cutting all 4 to their final lengths. I can see the finish line in sight, and all that's left is the final taper on these back legs. Look, mistakes will happen no matter how many times you put yourself in timeout planing on the ground. Smile and learn to roll with it. But happy days are ahead. Pat yourself on the back. We now have 4 front legs, 4 back legs, 4 armrests, and 6 back supports. Yes, 6, because I'm 90% certain I'll mess up the half lap first try. Foreshadowing? We'll find out. Fortunately for the robots, they don't need to worry about assembly and layouts when ripping off ideas from the internet and moshing it all together. Unfortunately for us, we do. In my chair experience, this is the part of the project that can ruin everything you've done up until now. Using a nice flat surface and something sturdy to anchor the parts against, like a table saw, really helps. The yoga mat doesn't hurt either. If your fence is too small, you could use a straight edge clamped to your workbench. Just get creative, people. Instead of measuring and marking each piece, I'm using spacers so I can duplicate this layout from one chair to the next. Consistency is more important than accuracy. My YouTube woodworking membership requires that I use a tool 90% of the people will gripe about to fasten the frame together. However, there is a much more budget option that I will demonstrate in a moment. So calm yourself. I'm doing 2 rows of floating tenons for extra strength. If you're using dowels as a substitute, I would suggest the same. Once the top row is done, I can adjust the height of the cutter and get back to work on the second row. Quick and easy. Option 2 is screws, and there are some tricks that I've learned over the years. Make sure you're using a nice, beefy stainless fastener, and it will provide plenty of strength. All of these chairs, or these, and these, were made with just screws. However, when you have dramatic angles, like this design, glue the frame up first. Once it's dry, come back and add your screws. Otherwise, the pieces will want to move on you when the screw is sunk. I like to use screws as an opportunity for contrast, so I draw out a hole with a Forstner bit and then plug with a different wood species. We have arrived at the most technical part of the build. For orientation's sake, I have the frame parts laid on the side. This is the bottom, this is the top. As I continue on my mission of reminding you that removing variables is the key to a better final product, notice that I have the bottom leg spacer block clamped back on, and I've cut a new spacer for the armrest. The backrest and arms will be joined together with a cross lap. Now, it's a reasonably easy joint, but what makes this challenging is the taper. The angle on the bottom side of this cross lap is actually different than the top side by just over 1.5 degrees. It's annoying, right? You can be really mad at me for that one. Once I have my backrest in position, I can mark my lines for where to start the cross lap on both pieces. I actually cut a pencil down to reach the underside here and now scribe my layout. Pay close attention because this can also bite you. The opposing side of the chair frame is not laid out the same way. Instead, the armrest is above the backrest while doing your layout. You will be a very sad perro if you cut all these cross laps on the same sides. I was seeing a lot of this microjig fit finder on Instagram a couple months back. So like any good content creator, I tagged microjig in a story asking a question I already knew the answer to, hoping they would just send me one. But they ignored me. So I bought one anyways, and I actually think it's a pretty decent product. With the blade height set to half the thickness of the frames, I can start hogging away material for the bottom side of the cross lap. The key is to slowly sneak up on your cut like I'm doing here, just taking small nibbles, not even moving the piece all the way through. You want to finish right up against the line without cutting the pencil mark. Since you're paying close attention, you know the opposing side needs a different angle. Once that's good, more hogging out material. The key for this side is to not really worry about the line. Once I get close, use the arm piece to test the width and keep sneaking up on it until an amazingly satisfying and snug fit. I realized after cutting 2 of the backrest cross laps, there's no reason to even measure for the opposing side pieces, because you can use the already cut parts as a referential guide to get it all exact when establishing your bottom side of the cross lap. But for the top side, I would still sneak up on the fit in case there is any slight deviations in material thicknesses. You might have been asking yourself earlier why the arms were overhanging the backrest so much. Well, it's because I know myself and use the excess that will be cut away later to do a test run of the opposing side of the cross lap. There's a lot of flipping and flopping, so it provides a nice safety net at this crucial point in the build. I will be the first to admit that my process or workflow is not optimized for speed in a lot of instances. But sanding interior pieces of the legs before assembly will save a lot of headaches once it's all put together. That was 120 grit, then a quick switch to 150. Thank you for paying attention earlier and remembering to save offcuts. They are going to be very helpful during assembly. I might be the only content creator schmuck that actually pays for their Starbond and doesn't have an affiliate link, but I still like using it, especially when I need a temporary holding solution on severe angles like this. You can adhere plywood directly to your workpiece, but I wouldn't try wood on wood. I'm a simple man and use Type-On 3 since it's waterproof. You will notice most of the glue I'm applying is inside the mortises or on the faces of the joints that are on the outside edges of the chair. This helps save you time cleaning up squeeze out, and the dominoes or dowels or screws are going to be plenty strong unless you plan on using your chair for any other non-chair related activities. Okay, I've been lying to you, and I'm sorry. But what you're seeing is 2 different frames being glued together. But through video magic and wearing the same clothes multiple days in a row, you would never know. The problem is, I'm cursed. I had already glued up one frame off camera, and it was smooth and painless. For whatever reason, things go haywire when I hit the record button and chaos ensues. I end up yelling at my cameraman or woman, who happens to be my wife, and then I feel bad, and the footage is useless. So, to make it up to her, she asked if you could hit the like and subscribe button if you're enjoying this video. Don't do it for me, do it for her. She appreciates it. While that dries, I can take a quick play break to keep the project manager happy, and then work on the front leg. I didn't do this all at once because clamps just get in the way of other clamps or mallets to tap things into place. I told you, it's not an optimized workflow here, just a dummy in the garage. But if you've cut everything correctly, this leg should slide into place easily. I only needed a squeeze clamp to hold it secure for a couple hours. The nice thing about green tape in the Sarbon method is the enjoyment of knocking off the blocks after. Before flush cutting the armrests, I want to remove the majority of the excess material so I can get some really great close-up shots for you that make it appear like I actually know how to film a video. But the truth is, I don't. This is a Sweezan flush trim saw, and I have flush cut hundreds, maybe even thousands of plugs with it over the years, and it still works great. Highly recommend this one. Speaking of not knowing what I'm doing, occasionally you can make it appear like you're half decent at woodworking because look at that crispy joint. The project manager insisted I stop procrastinating and do some touch-up sanding on the inside faces now, and then hit all of the frames using 150 grit for a quick once-over. Not sure how I ended up with a bad gap on one of the frames, but no worries, I can fix that. I started by cutting down a scrap piece, testing the fit, and then sanding it until I got it snug. You can use an air compressor to force glue down into a thin joint like this, and give it a nice taparoo to seal the deal. I also learned after filming that my shop might be haunted. Is that an orb? I think it's an orb. And 5 minutes later, we can pretend like we never had that accident in the first place. Isn't woodworking so fun? It's actually not fun because at this point, doubt started to creep back in about this entire project. I think on a scale of 1 to comfortable, we're at like Spirit Airlines economy class, best case scenario right now.
So not comfortable.
Not comfortable at all. Doubt aside, I'm going to push on with these chairs in the name of science and hoping I can win this for the robots. Since I had some leftover 6/4 stock, I can resaw that to cut the seat frame and slat pieces. I'll spare you another jointing and planing montage and skip right into cutting all the parts to width. Is that because I'm lazy and didn't feel like editing? Or I forgot to hit the record button on the camera? You will never know if it was either or none of the above. Just remember that your fence doesn't move once you get it locked in place, so make sure you have all necessary parts ready to go. Also, if you're looking for a great refresher on table saw safety, I made a video a couple months back that is well worth the watch. As we brace for an upcoming election year, I am announcing my candidacy on the following platform. Miter saws don't suck. Well, good miter saws don't suck. No longer should your miter saw be considered an outcast. Look, I cut all these parts the final length, and they are dead on square. For all the lonely saws collecting dust in the corner, I hear you. I'm your candidate. Vote Lincoln Street, 2024. I could give you another long, drawn-out narrative about different joinery methods you can use for assembling the seat and back frame, but how about I take a different tact since it's later in the video and I'm feeling spicy. I'm going to use the Damo again because I worked my ass off one summer building a bunch of chairs to afford one. If you have tool envy, you can do the same thing, or just keep complaining. But no, you're missing out on the patented Hibbs hip thrust. But seriously, do whatever and quit letting tools you don't currently own become a barrier to entry for projects. I personally believe one of the most underrated items in a workshop is a big flat surface for assembly. I started out building on my back porch and would set up plywood on folding tables. I hated it, but it worked. If you're struggling with putting your project together and don't have a suitable bench, I would move that to the top of your priorities list. I'll double check the interior measurement for the seat slats, which is why I waited on cross-cutting the parts. But now I can bring them back over to my running mate for the upcoming election and chop all these down to size. My miter saw station was my first shop project over 3 years ago. It has served me very well, but it is time for an upgrade and I'll have a video with a new design and improvements coming in the next couple of months. There are a lot of ways to attach slats to a frame, but I wanted to create something that felt accessible for those building along and looked halfway decent. With the slats flat on the workbench, I can place these two pieces on top, which will soon create an artificial rabbet. Mark a line for where to make the cut and then trim it to size. I have no idea if this is a faster or slower way of doing it, but the main goal here was to give myself a lot of surface area for the slats to sit on when I screw these in later. It was a nice day and the birds were chirping, so I decided to let Mother Nature sponsor this portion of the video. The only thing to be mindful of is not rounding over areas where two parts will meet if you don't want a visible shadow line. I do want that for this piece, but it is completely dealer's choice on the aesthetic you're going for. I'll show you an example of that later. At this point, I had made a mess and reached my fresh air quota for the week, so back indoors to round over the side frames. The real story is I was getting hot. If you want to get a similar appearance that I'll have on the finished product, this is a 1/8 inch roundover bit from Whiteside, which is my go-to for a nice clean look. I bet you've been thinking, John, those armrests are way too sharp. But you're wrong. They're actually not sharp enough. In fact, many people say a dull blade is more dangerous than a sharp one. I mean, I see absolutely no scenario where this is a bad idea. Okay, maybe it was a bad idea. You want the tactile experience of your hand meeting the chair to be pleasant. So I'll take more time than normal refining the shape of each armrest until I get something I'm happy with. This is where function fights form. In the end, do whatever suits your own needs. If you are building these chairs to live outdoors, I would highly suggest making this next step mandatory. End grain that is making direct contact with the ground will allow water to weep up into the wood, eventually causing damage or permanent rot, like these legs. To prevent that from happening, a simple thin layer of epoxy will dress your chair up with some fun-looking shoes and keep your feet dry for years to come. I learned that trick from the man who talks to wood very quietly. If you're in a rush, I've even used a 5-minute epoxy in the past and it works quite well. Getting the frames nice and level like you saw me doing earlier will allow the epoxy to self-level and completely cover the exposed end grain. When you get a little leakage, which is likely, don't panic, it's a simple cleanup after everything hardens up. While that happens, it's a perfect opportunity to work on the slats. The bottom slats will be screwed in, and those screws will be recessed with a 1/2 inch Forstner bit. You could eyeball it, but this isn't some bullshit ragtag operation here. You see, it even says it on the marquee. I would consider myself the king of making ugly but functional jigs, and this one is no different. A couple pieces of plywood stuck on with carpet tape, but it works. Once the first side is done, flip the stop over and repeat for the opposing sides. Despite the ugly jig, the results will make it appear like you planned this whole thing out. After our little shoes have dried properly, you can see what the damage was. Again, a little leakage like this isn't a big deal. Now you could take an extra 20 minutes really sealing it up before, but it's not worth the time because a quick pass with a quality sandpaper like this one will clean up the legs in less than a minute. To prevent the epoxy from chipping out if the feet are dragged on the ground, you should add a chamfer or round over like I'm doing here. And would you believe it, folks? It's actually time to assemble this robot's dream chair. Now you might find this hard to believe, but the project manager and I don't have a great plan here. We're just kind of winging it. But my idea was to mark the key points where the sides meet the bottom frame, and then clamp on some scrap pieces of wood that would act as a seat for my seat. I found when assembling chairs, there really is never a smooth way to do it when working solo. So rather than take a lot of planning, I just manhandle the pieces with squeeze clamps, eventually finding my way. It might look awkward, but it gets the job done. After sliding the back support into place, I started to formulate a plan on the next order of operations, which is something beginners tend to lose sight of. Let me give you some examples while I put this together. The seat and back will be attached to the sides with glue and screws. So now is a great time to use that same 1/2 inch Forstner bit to recess said screws. The major plot hole came where the backrest meets the seat frame. Now the smart thing to do would be driving in dowels or screws from the outside of the frame, but I wanted to keep it clean looking. Instead, a simple pocket hole on the underside will get the job done all the same. Our screw is going to be strong enough for attaching the seat frame. Remember, you're getting the added benefit of long grain to long grain glue surfaces here, which is quite beefy. Did I do a strength test? No. But to be blunt, I think 99% of these tests on YouTube that you see are ridiculous because they rarely talk about practical applications or day-to-day forces that are exerted on our furniture. We tend to way over-engineer and overbuild our projects. Just don't let 5 John Malecki sit in the chair and you should be fine.
Let me know if any of you guys know where 4 John Maleckis are for sale.
The back frame shouldn't need any fasteners because there is so much glue surface area here. If you want to add an insurance policy, go ahead. I'm going to set the over-under for 15 times a year total that these chairs will actually be used at my house. Consider them more like front yard decorations. Speaking of, whatever happened to the flamingos or lawn gnomes? Those were the real heroes of any house growing up. Now the real hero of this assembly has been squeeze clamps. So much easier to use than F-style in my experience. Do they create enough pressure? I think so, because you shouldn't need to muscle anything into place. All you're looking for is a slight glue squeeze out on the mating pieces. Which reminds me, it was really dumb to round over this outer portion of the backrest frame because cleanup was quite annoying. This lovely specimen is a plug cutter, and it allows you to quickly drill out face frame plugs to cover holes, like the ones I used to drive in the screws. They do pop right out with a screwdriver, but it's so much more enjoyable watching them fall out with a bandsaw. Back to this idea of order of operations. The main reason I made a faux rabbet joint was to leave myself plenty of room to drive screws into the middle of the board. It might be slower, but you don't run the risk of landing a screw so close to the edge of a board and having it split. It also left me a nice big surface area for clamps during the initial assembly. If you can get into the habit of thinking through the entire process and not just what you're doing at the moment, you will save yourself a lot of future headaches. Trust me, I've been there. These two scrap pieces will act as a seat for the faux rabbet piece to sit on while it's being clamped, ensuring it lines up with the bottom of the frame perfectly, and the eventual slats sit flush with the top of the frame so your tuchus has a pleasant experience while relaxing on the chair. Just remember to clean up any glue squeeze out, even though no one will see this. Ever. The backrest is also getting a faux rabbet, but I do have some concerns that I will address about this part of the chair shortly. Now, I've received a lot of negative or concerned comments about wearing flip-flops in my videos. And you know what? You guys are right. So I've listened, and I took them off. So hopefully barefoot makes you happier. As I mentioned at the start of the video, I am not a designer. And in my infinite wisdom, I did not think through this back portion of the chair very well. In the AI model, it has a nice thin back support, which is fine in the robot world, but it doesn't give you a lot of options for construction. This faux rabbet ended up being a little too thin for my liking and made it impossible to use a screw. So I'm using glue here. Don't worry, I have adjusted the planes accordingly to give you more heft, but if I hadn't said anything, you probably wouldn't have even noticed. Just be sure to use blocks to ensure consistent spacing when putting the slats in. While that glue sets up for an hour, it's time for the final prep before applying finish. I like to hand sand all the faces and edges, and once that's done, use a combination of the air compressor and a vacuum to remove any dust sitting on the wood surface. There are two paths you can take when finishing a project like this: a film finish or a penetrating oil. Film finishes are harder to apply, but will give you more protection. However, when they fail, and they will eventually fail if left in the sun like these chairs, you need to sand it all back to bare wood and reapply. We're talking hours of work. A penetrating oil offers much less protection, but recoating once a year is a simple and quick process. For instance, this is a planter box I made last spring that needed a refresh. 5 minutes later, it looks brand new and will be good to go for another 12 months. You can choose what's best for your situation and sun exposure. The bottom slats can be screwed in using 1-inch outdoor screws and the same spacer blocks from the backrest. If you want to use glue, by all means, skip the screw and glue them into place. It's your world. Do whatever you like. After weeks of building, filming, and editing, we can finally find out if AI knows comfort. To keep things unbiased, this is my neighbor John. So, what do you think?
You know, it doesn't totally suck. See ya.